Okay, in this presentation, I'm going to go through the last two parts of your rough draft for your zine. So you want to now take parts 1, 2, and combine them with 3 and 4, and just make sure that this is what you're trying to do in the zine that you send to me in November. So we want to start by imagining rights within a context of structural historical injustices. In other words, we don't want to think about rights just in the year 2020 or in 2012 or one particular year. You want to see it as a process over time. So the easiest way to do this is to compare one thing to 5 other things. So if we take cultural supremacy or domination by white folks, then you'll see that there's racial injustice, gender injustice, cultural injustice, poverty injustice, and climate injustice, all kind of coming from the same place. So each of you has kind of looked at a political or a social issue that you care about, and so now you want to try to connect it. How does it connect to an injustice based on these categories? And the easiest example is to see, well, what is dominance by the majority group, and how does that affect the issue that you're researching? So I want to offer some legal cases within each of those categories so you can learn a little bit more and get a better sense of how this works. So for racial injustice, the best case to look at would be Scott versus Sanford, because this really attacks the issue of equality, and it kind of brings out exactly what the main problems were at the time that the slave trade was legal, and kind of leading up into the 14th Amendment and the 15th and 13th Amendment as being related to those things. So this gives you kind of a context for what cultural supremacy looks like as it relates to racial injustice. The next case would be if you're interested in gender injustice or sexuality injustice, you could look at Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now, this really gets at the alleged right of privacy and whether you have one or not, and whether our rights are restricted only to what the Bill of Rights say, or if there are other rights that the founders intended but couldn't know about, say, electronic surveillance, for example, or in this case, reproductive services. So you'd want to read in this case to see what is the test the Supreme Court applies when the state or a government actor tries to interfere with an individual's personal liberty. Then we have a more recent case, Hawaii versus Trump, and this is if you're interested in kind of migration or ethnicity issues, or if you're interested in ICE. This would be the thing you'd want to look at to see how does the court view the balance between a government interest and the rights of groups. And again, this will give you kind of a better perspective on what is allowed and what's the framework to make these decisions within over time. And then if you're interested in poverty cases, then you can, or economic injustice, Brown versus Board of Education, especially part 2 or case 2, really helps you understand some of the inequalities that we have today when it comes to both economics and education and how those two things are related. And then finally, if you're interested in climate justice or air pollution or the environment, then you can look at EPA versus Homer City Generation and see how the court tries to assign a role to the federal government, but states also have their own part to play. And that really is a balance that is difficult to manage with the international corporation. And you can see the court trying to come up with a way to do this. And while science is capable of doing this, the constitutional structure kind of has an unequal balance towards corporations against individuals like you and me. So you want to think about this case if you're interested more in like the structure of government and whose role is it to undo or fix an injustice. And so what you want to think about is this, and this is probably the hardest part for most of you, but in the kind of right to control versus the right to resist, we want to look at again through time within the structure. And so if you think about 1787, so what did the folks who were discriminating or harming other people learn? Well, they learned that they had a political right to exclude another group of people. In 1860, they learned that they had a political right to dehumanize another in the Scott versus Sanford case. In 1950, through Board of Education, you see that the one group has an economic right to exclude another. In 1970, with the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case, which is referring back to both Roe v. Wade and Griswold versus Connecticut, you see that one group has a moral right to burden another group. In 2005, where you kind of see the rise of cases that lead to Hawaii versus Trump with the Iraq war invasion, the Patriot Act, and the so-called war on terror, you'll see that one group has a preemptive right to use violence against another globally. And then finally, in 2020, you see with the Hawaii case really kind of showing that that right can be extended to also exclude others globally. So now you can kind of see how one group, one dominant group, who's trying to maintain their control, has learned how to use rights over time, and start to think about what would groups need to do in order to learn how to resist, with the understanding that the constant group, white males, have had the right to vote since 1787, whereas other groups haven't had the right to vote until much more recently. So then, if you want to think about it in what I'm trying to get you to do here with legal language and how to put it in context, you'd look at the blue column to the right. And so this is the kind of language that you want to use, and I'll give you some examples. So in this case, or unlike this case. So you could say something like, in this case, Garrity versus New Jersey, police officers were given due process when they were accused of X, Y, and Z. But unlike Texas versus Lawrence, Garrity does not extend that right to privacy indefinitely. And then you might say something like the case Griswold versus Connecticut, rights are being defined through the ultimate right to the government or the state to balance the interests of its citizens. And that's kind of just the language. Again, the specifics will kind of be more on what you're working on, but that's all we're kind of looking for here. You don't need to write 3 pages, right? Remember, this is only like a 1-page zine or a 3-slide presentation kind of format, political cartoon. You have all these creative options. So you're not trying to get a bunch of text on there. But when you do use text in the language you use, I'm getting you to try to use legal language. So the main thing is that you want to identify some rule. So if the Fourth Amendment says you have the right to be free from unwarranted search and seizure, then that's the rule. Legal facts are basically the story you're trying to tell. So Scott was told that he was freed after being enslaved, and so he presented that case, right, that petition to the court, and the court ruled against him after a series of cases. The other thing you might think about is like under the rule of law. So in other words, under the right to control and the right to resist, how does your example or the story you're trying to tell through your zine, how does this get to that perception of the rule of right? Is it balanced towards the right to control? Is it balanced more towards the right to resist? Or is it somewhere in the middle, and how are you defining that? And then try to identify a fundamental principle. So is it liberty that you care about? Is it security? Is it equality? Is it dignity? Right? What is the thing that you're really trying to get at? And then try to provide a remedy to the conflict or the issue that you're really concerned about. So if you think ICE is breaking the law, then abolish ICE is a nice phrase, but you'd have to explain how that would actually happen. Would that be a bill in Congress? Would that be a Supreme Court case? How would that actually occur in real life? And then if you wanted to compare this is what the green column is. If you want to compare this to, say, your literature class or a philosophy class, the pink and the green categories trying to show you how this works. So probably, I won't go into too much detail on this presentation because I don't want you to get caught up on this. I'd rather you focus on using legal language. But if you wanted to see kind of how this works, then this is how you would see it. I will likely come back to this slide after I look at your drafts and try to fine tune them. So it'd be good for you to maybe take some notes or just to think about this. But don't worry about applying this to your draft. And then the same thing goes for the first column. about the yellow column here. And that I'm just showing you how law uses metaphors and similes and how they use kind of literature type language to make steps towards legal language. And that's really the main thing there. And then finally, just make sure you use this legal language in the context that I've showed you, and email me a rough draft of your zine by November 17th, and I'll remind you on the website. Thank you.